Welcome back. This is part 3 of my ongoing series on demonology. If you haven't watched the other 2 videos, please go check them out because I'm sort of building on a lot of ideas here. I think today's video is going to be really important because we're going to be talking about discernment. And I think discernment is going to be a particularly relevant subject matter and topic, not only for our own discussion, but for how we interface with reality as a whole moving forward. That may sound strange and a strange way to put it, and perhaps it is. But when I started making this video series, the reason I did so is because of what they're referring to now as the age of disclosure. Okay, and it's this idea that there's going to be a lot of stuff that's going to be revealed to people over the remaining months, really, of 2026. And in fact, certain individuals, whether correctly or incorrectly, are saying that there's going to be a lot of things that come out later in 2026, sometime between like April and which we're in now. Actually, we're in May. So starting in April, but going all the way to October. Now, what's interesting about that also from an occult standpoint is if you know anything about the calendar of the occult, your high days where the most demonic activity takes place actually coincide with that exact time frame, April and October. So is that just happenstance? I don't think so. But we're going to talk about a lot of different things here. Now, what's being talked about now recently is this releasing of files around UAP and UFO phenomena. Okay, this has been something that's slowly emerging over time and has become very, very, let's say this, prevalent within cultural discussions. Okay, and it used to be considered a fringy space, but it's getting a lot of attention, and even top tier academics are really starting to dialogue with this. Of course, now we have the release of some of these documents. Supposedly there will be more, and it's creating a lot of confusion. Okay, so this is why discernment is going to be so important. With that said, I don't think this is just related to UAP and UFO. I've already made it clear that I believe this is a spiritual phenomenon, but I think there's going to be a lot of other things that start to come out as part of this age of disclosure. So one of the things I want to look at today is breaking down some of these cultural movements that that you can expect to see moving forward, and some of which we're already starting to see. And then I'm going to give you my opinion on this and how I think we can use the Bible and the scriptures to help us discern this material. Okay? So I want to begin actually looking at a couple passages in the Old Testament. So I'm going to make sure I have the right book in my hands here. We're going to start with Leviticus, and then we're going to move into Deuteronomy. So if you turn to Leviticus chapter 19, if you have your Bible on you, and Leviticus 19, and it's going to be verse 31. So chapter 19, verse 31. I have to hold it really far away so I can read this tiny little print. Okay, in verse 31, it says, "Do not turn to mediums or consult familiar spirits," is what it technically says. Okay, "or you will be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God." Let's also look at Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 10 and 11. Actually, I'll start with verse 9. It says, "When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not imitate the detestable customs of those nations. No one among you is to make their son or daughter pass through fire, practice divination, tell fortunes, interpret omens, practice sorcery, cast spells, consult a medium or a familiar spirit, or inquire of the dead." Keep those 2 verses in mind because they are going to be relevant as we move forward. There's also going to be several other passages I'm going to read. But for now, I want to start with an analogy because I think analogies are helpful. Okay. When I was a kid, there was a very popular film series called Back to the Future. Okay. And it's a story, for those who haven't seen it, probably most have, about a man, an older scientist who creates a time machine. And he and a young high school student named Marty travel through time and kind of get into various situations and scenarios. And it's fun and it's entertaining and yada, yada, yada. Anyways, for the reason of this discussion, in the second movie, which is Back to the Future Part 2, as it's called, in this story, they use this time machine to go into the future. And while they're there, Marty, the chief protagonist, the young high school boy, gets an idea in his head, which is that if he had certain information about the future and he took that information back into the past, he could utilize that information for his own gain. So what he does is he purchases in a bookstore a sports almanac. And in this sports almanac, it gives all the scores and wins of different teams throughout history. But of course, it's giving those scores from the future, meaning when he goes back in the past, he'll be able to take that almanac, utilize that information to gamble and bet, and be able to win every single time. He thinks it's a brilliant idea. Thankfully, he doesn't get away with it because his much smarter and more careful companion, the other protagonist named Doc, the designer of the time machine, explains to the young Marty, no, you can't do that. If you do that, first of all, it's wrong because you're utilizing this technology for evil. But second, it risks disrupting the natural order of events. You're changing the timeline. After Marty gets this information, he discards the sports almanac into the trash bin, and he and Doc go about on their adventure. But what we as the viewer see is that the chief villain of the story, right, named Biff, is in the background listening to this. He hears Marty's story. He fishes the almanac out of the trash. He steals the time machine when they're preoccupied. He travels back into the past, gives the almanac to his younger self, travels back into the future, and Marty and Doc have no idea this has happened. They don't figure it out until they get in the time machine, travel back to the past, and see the past has changed. It's no longer the past that was there when they left. And what happens, and the movie shows this, is it creates these two different parallel timelines. One of them is the one that Doc and Marty came out of when they left. The other is the new timeline where Biff now is this wealthy, famous entrepreneur because he's utilized this information from the sports almanac to gamble and win sports bets. Obviously, what Doc and Marty have to do is go back in time and retrieve the almanac from Biff and stop this alternate timeline from happening. Okay. Hopefully it makes sense. Hopefully that makes sense. If you've seen the movie, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Why am I having this conversation? The reason I'm having this conversation is because as we look at the narrative of human history, you're going to find that there's multiple accounts, multiple stories, multiple belief structures, many ideologies. But when you take a broad spectrum view of this, you kind of have two essential timelines. What's interesting about this is that both of these timelines or possible futures or possible realities interpret the other as being the source of the problem. Now, we've talked about the Christian tradition. In my Bible study, where I did a whole series of videos, 10 videos in total, where I tried to walk people through the narrative of the scriptures, I showed how the coming of Jesus of Nazareth was a direct reaction in response to counteract the actions of the enemy, the devil, and to set creation right again, okay? One of the ways this happens is by sending a deluge. God says in the book of Genesis, we've talked about Genesis 6 multiple times, right? It's the inspiration for the book of Enoch, which has become particularly popular of late. And it says that, these sons of God mated with the daughters of men, and they had offspring with them, and that they imparted knowledge to them. We later learn in Genesis that there's a third fall, which is where human beings take this knowledge that they've been given to advance themselves in such a way where they're able to build this tower into the sky. And it becomes such a problem that God then has to disperse humans around the globe. We talked about that a little bit in the last video in terms of the setting up of principalities and territories around the world. What does this have to do with what we're talking about today? What does this have to do with this idea of two different timelines? Well, the Christian tradition says that by God intervening in a deluge like the flood, or in the dispersion of humans throughout the globe, or even in the coming of Christ to redeem humanity and to restore the relationship through the Holy Spirit that they now have with God, that he is setting an incorrect timeline back to its proper way. Meaning that when God designed Adam and Eve, he had a specific way he intended them to live. But as a result of sin, that timeline was disrupted. And therefore, he, like Marty and Doc, had to go fix it. Okay? Well, it turns out there's a different story, a counter story, which we're going to talk about today. A long time ago, there was a man. He was born out of the Greco-Roman world, and he would change the way people thought and lived. There's many stories about this man. In one story, he approaches a group of fishermen, and he tells them to cast their net into the sea, and that he'll tell them, predict that their nets will fill, and he'll even tell them how many fish are there. In another one, it says that he rejected a life of prosperity and wealth and chose a life of asceticism. He also lived in a communal setting where he worked with other people in order to promote a new way of living and thinking. This man was prophesied about before his birth, and they prophesied his birth, saying he would come and the things he would offer. He was said to be able to perform miracles, and that meant even calming and controlling the sea, predicting weather, and in some cases, even healing sick people. And lastly, within his circle, in his life of asceticism, he contained or held what many believed was secret knowledge. And while he talked to people in the public and he provided learning to all, only the elect people around him really knew the inner secrets of his teachings. This man's name is Pythagoras, and he was actually born several hundred years before Christ. Pythagoras is an interesting name because the root of his name is Python, the same word, Pythagoras, Python. And the end of his name, Agoros, comes from Argos, or the Acropolis, the city, or the place where people dwell and learn. His name literally means the serpent who brings knowledge to the people. Think about that for a minute. Pythagoras becomes a very important person throughout all of history, but certainly Western history. He becomes a key figure of many counter-religious traditions as well as the occult. What I believe is going to happen is that as we move forward into this age of disclosure, the story of Jesus of Nazareth isn't going to be dismissed. However, it's going to be reinterpreted in many ways. And Jesus is going to be viewed like Pythagoras and others. Individuals like Siddhartha Gautama, the man who comes to be known as the Buddha. If you don't know his story, he was born a prince, born of a king. And he lived this charmed life, but he had this compelling need to leave his father's temple and to wander and walk amongst the people. And when he was out of the temple for the first time, he saw suffering. and he dedicates his life to trying to find a way to end human suffering. Okay? He does this through these various acts of meditation and through showing kindness and grace and all these kinds of things. All of these men have been influential, but only in the case of Jesus of Nazareth did he claim to be the literal Son of God. And this is going to be the most significant point as we move forward in this discussion. One of the things I've been trying to talk about through all of this is by anchoring these ideas in other things, other traditions. I've talked a great deal about ancient myths, and I've showed you how the stories within the book of Genesis, including those we find in Genesis 6 and books like Enoch, are actually found in other texts. Okay, I do a whole video on this. If you want to watch it, you can go on my channel, scroll down, you'll find it. Okay. But what we're starting to see now, and I think is going to be a pivotal part of this age of disclosure, is a return to these ancient myths where we're revisiting them, but recognizing that they may not be as mythic as we once thought. That actually these stories are revealing deep, hidden, and in some cases, secret truths. We will see and are already seeing a real strong interest in ancient civilizations. And what's starting to happen, some of it's through technological advancement, the use of things like LiDAR and the ability to sort of use lasers to map ground, and they're finding these new discoveries. But some of it, I think, has to do with some of what has probably been known for a very long time that had been kept secret. There's going to be a new emphasis on these past civilizations as civilizations who actually were far more advanced than we are now. So rather than looking at what's dominated Western civilization for the last several hundred years, essentially since Darwin proposed, evolution by natural selection, and there's this idea of sort of a perpetual, gradual improvement through, survival of the fittest. This model is saying, actually, from what we're finding, it looks like there was a period in time where humans were very, very advanced. This would explain how they could build things like the pyramids and all these massive structures. And then something happened. They call this the Younger Dryas impact theory. And what it's saying is that a meteor fell from the sky, a large one. It hit the Earth. And as a result, it caused what? A global flood. We know that all of these ancient civilizations have a flood story, including the Christian narrative. But in this interpretation, this event is a natural disaster that sets humans back because they now just have to survive. And what happens in this process is the knowledge gets lost. And then it becomes a responsibility of other individuals, or in some cases, other things, to bring that knowledge back to humanity. This is why ancient myths and ancient civilizations are going to be really important. But it doesn't just stop there. Because we live in a post-Christian era as a result of the Enlightenment, where many people have rejected Christianity because they've rejected spiritual realities as a whole, people have moved into this modality of scientific reductionism, okay? However, what's now happening within the space of science is that they're realizing that the reductionist model doesn't work, particularly in the realm of quantum physics and quantum mechanics. Turns out reality is far more peculiar than we ever imagined. Without going down too much detail into all the science, again, I have videos on this as well. If you want to learn about the interface theory of reality, you can watch that on my channel also. But suffice to say, people are now opening themselves up to different ideas. And this is going to result in two different movements. One of them is a new form of spirituality, New Thought movement, which is actually just a reinvention or rebranding of the New Age movement. The other is a return to folk religions or animistic religions, i.e., the religions that were prevalent and existed prior to the Christian religion becoming the dominant religion of humanity. Obviously, there's other religions, Judaism, Islam, which are still widely prevalent. All of those anchor themselves in the Old Testament, okay? They obviously have different opinions about Jesus, which makes them relevant for our discussion moving forward. But there's going to be a return to these folk religions. A lot of this has been lost under the guise of mythology in ancient civilizations in the West, which is why, I've already mentioned this. But what's interesting is that many of these ideas still were continued to be practiced and now have moved with people in Africa. So if you know anything about West African religious traditions, particularly the Yoruba tribe, sometimes I say Yoruba tribe, that's centered out of Nigeria, Benin, West Africa, they had a strong tradition of a religious practice known as Ishishe. Okay, when Westerners begin the slave trade and they start bringing Africans over from, start bringing, yes, slaves from Africa, they pull primarily from this territory. And these people bring their Yoruba or Ashishe practices throughout the West and primarily in the Caribbean islands. Okay, so there's many different names for these things. You have it in Cuba as Santeria. You have hoodoo in voodoo or voodoo that comes out of like Haiti. You have what is it? Umbada and man, there's so many. There's Shango, that's Trinidadian. Obie is Jamaican. All of these essentially are the rebranding of these African religions, and they're sort of blending them with their local traditions and cultures, and oftentimes infusing them weirdly with Christianity. And what's interesting about these practices is they don't see their practice in conflict with Christianity. In fact, they look at a lot of the Catholic saints as just different models of the same gods they serve. To give a specific example, in all of these sort of Yoruba religious models, they tend to have a pantheon of deities that they refer to as orishas. At least that's what they're referred to in like Santeria. If you look into Haitian voodoo or voodoo, it is referred to as the Loa. Okay, and these are mediating beings that are here, okay, to help humans mediate themselves to the one true God. Uh, they're not all exactly the same, but there's a lot of similarities. So, like in Santeria, and basically the overarching Yoruba sort of ideology, there's a distant god named Olodumare, and he's so far removed from earthlings in the earth that he's not accessible. So he has these other demigods, orishas, demigod, daemon, demons. This is where the term comes from. It's actually used by Plato in Greek. But these traditions don't view the demigods or the demons as malevolent beings. They view them as benevolent beings that are there to help them achieve a higher knowledge and reach God. It also incorporates a lot of elements of ancestral worship, okay, and things like this. These religious traditions are also becoming more and more popular at a cultural level. Keep that in mind. Going back to modern science, we're starting to see with the age of disclosure, but also just with interest and probably some of the recent discoveries in spaces like quantum mechanics and also with the invention of artificial intelligence, there's this new space within science where they're talking openly about a lot of things. And that includes everything like psionic experiences, being psychic, to things like remote viewing, okay, where people are able to do remote viewing. And a lot of these people who've been doing this for a very long time, working with, in our case, our federal government, are coming out public about this stuff. And some of these things that they were able to do, where they were able to utilize this higher set of knowledge to tap into things, okay? Lastly, on my list, you're going to see a movement, and we're already starting to see this, in alternative Christian doctrine. Some years back, a writer by the name of Dan Brown wrote a novel called The Da Vinci Code. It was very popular. It was made into a movie, a couple movies with Tom Hanks. And essentially, what Dan Brown was doing was he was introducing the populace to a fictional platform of a lot of very real ideas that exist in the esoteric tradition. Okay? There are actually many groups who fall under this umbrella, but probably the most well-known and most notable are the Freemasons. Okay? You'll hear terms like the Illuminati. Okay? That's another one. The Rosicrucians. Okay? The Sinclairs. You'll hear terms like the Knights Templar. Okay? All of these are different orders of people throughout history who were tasked, according to their own tradition, with retrieving and maintaining this esoteric tradition. Okay? Many of them claim to have access to a lot of very, very secret, very important information. And a lot of this relates directly to the Christian tradition. Okay? If you know anything about Nazi history, you'll know that one of the things that was really interesting, well, there's a lot of interesting things, but one of the things that was really interesting about the Nazis is their obsession with archaeological artifacts. They were going back and finding all these ancient artifacts, okay, including the Spear of Destiny, which is one that Hitler was particularly fascinated with. The Indiana Jones movies essentially capture this reality in a fictionalized form. Well, what's going on here? Remember my two timelines, Back to the Future? The alternative timeline, which I believe is going to be the age of disclosure, is going to argue that the correct path was the path that humans were on. They had this insightful knowledge that they received on high, and that the people or things that they received this from were higher order beings, whether they're interdimensional, whether they are demigods, whether they're aliens. It will probably fall into the alien camp, but they'll define aliens in a very broad spectrum way as entities of non-human origin, meaning they're not human, they're something other. But that they brought this knowledge to humans, but unfortunately there was this catastrophic event that set them back. And they've actually been trying to bring humans back up to the state that they were at before this catastrophic event took place, but that this goal has been interrupted. Okay? And they're going to look at that as being largely related to the emergence of Christianity. Now, they're not going to deny that Christ was real or that he wasn't an influential sage or prophet. What they are going to argue is the way that he has been portrayed throughout Christian history as we know it is false. That in fact, he was not the literal Son of God, that he was a prophet like Siddhartha Gautama or Pythagoras, and that he was sent by them. And they're actually going to provide evidence of things like archaeological finds. They're going to show tombs that are going to have names on them like Jesus and Mary, and they're going to find the tombs of children, okay? And they're going to claim that this is actually Jesus of Nazareth and that he actually was married to Mary Magdalene and that they had children. And that what happened was the Catholic Church and others in power essentially took the teachings of Christ and perverted it into this thing that became useful for them to suppress humanity. They will probably target Paul, the Apostle Paul, and say that Paul never met Jesus, which is true, although he did meet him in a vision, and that Paul is the chief writer of the New Testament, also true, but that Paul is the one who introduces this new theology that contradicts the true theology. And they will likely link that true theology to John the Baptist, okay? They will use real life events and real life people to build this narrative. They are going to say that John the Baptist was an Essene. We know he lived in the wilderness, and we know that the Essenes, a Gnostic group, was also hiding in the wilderness because they had secret knowledge or ideas that were not considered orthodox by the Jews and then later by the Christians. Because of this, they were not welcomed. And because of people like St. Augustine, who was a Manichaean and studied Gnostic thought, who then converted to Christianity, he actively suppressed this particular branch of Christianity. But what they're going to do is they're going to introduce a series of documents, many of which have already been released, which are called Gnostic Gospels. There may be more. And they're going to try to utilize this to actually offer this counter narrative and to also expose these things that they're teaching. Okay? They are going to claim that they have been the holders of this esoteric knowledge in efforts to preserve the tradition to where it should be. Two conflicting storylines, both with very different interpretations. Now, it should be remembered that the devil is not a creator, he's a liar. And he works best by stealing what God has created. He's going to steal the story and invert it and basically say that no, it's this Christian tradition coming through this idea of Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, the Son of God, that has actually suppressed and repressed humanity. The age of disclosure is going to argue, possibly, this is conjecture at this point for me, that we actually arrived here not through the direct creation of one God, but that we were genetically created by higher orders of beings who were of non-human origin, who came to the planet, and that there was a war between these entities, and that many of them were imparting knowledge to humans, and humans were advancing at a rapid and successful rate until this catastrophic event. It brings in ancient civilizations. It brings in the explanation of these folk religions, where these orishas or Lwa or aliens, whatever you want to say, were actually potentially real things that were there mediating this message. It just had to be tapped into through some type of psionic experience. It explains modern science, okay? And it also allows these alternative religious traditions to move to the forefront. And they're going to try to link all this together into a nice little bow and create this narrative that's going to be about restoring this alternate timeline. Okay? A timeline of disclosure, an age of enlightenment. The way that people are talking about this in this space already, they're talking about this new age is coming where we will evolve to a higher level of consciousness. This is the type of language that they're talking about. Well, that is Gnosticism. That is the tradition that was already prevalent in the first century that was suppressed by the church for a reason, and that is because it is not of God. Okay? The other thing they're going to show you, which is going to be interesting, is that these ideas have been being preserved right in front of our eyes. Some of it will be actual artifacts they're able to produce, including what I believe to be aerial craft, UFOs or UAPs. The people in this space that are talking about it say that we have craft that are very, very old and that came from these archaeological spaces. Okay? Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But the idea is there. And what the idea, I think, is going to suggest is that these advanced civilizations had the ability to build these things. This would also explain the reverse engineering programs that are now coming out with people like Bob Lazar. He came out like in the late 80s or 90s and talked about working at Area 51 on the sports craft UFO And he says that there were multiple crafts in our possession. One of the interesting things about this phenomenon is that people report seeing real craft in the sky. And in some cases, we have evidence, again, this is conjecture, according to reports, of actual physical evidence. I believe, and I think that this will be supported eventually, that this is probably a multifaceted thing. I think there could be that there were craft from bygone days when humans were maybe potentially more advanced prior to this cataclysm. But it's also possible that these are craft that have been created either through reverse engineering program or just advanced technologies that have been secreted away, and that they're so far beyond the technology that we're used to, they appear alien in origin. So I think it could be both. It could be a both and. Again, who knows? I don't know. That's conjecture as well. But I want to read a couple more scriptures because all of this is going somewhere. Let's look at 2 Thessalonians, okay, 2, 9 through 12. 2 Thessalonians, oops, I just passed it. Here we go. 2, 9 through 12. Find verse 9, right? Here. It says this: the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power and false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing, because they refuse to love the truth and to be saved. Therefore, God sends them a strong delusion, so that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe the truth, but had pleasure in unrighteousness. There's going to be a delusion, and God's going to allow it because people have taken pleasure in their unrighteousness. Let's look at Hebrews. Book of Hebrews back here. This is going to be two different passages from Hebrews. Let's start with 9, chapter 9, verse 15. There's chapter 9. Verse 15 says this. This is speaking about Christ. Therefore, he, Jesus, is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. Okay, keep that in the back of your mind, and then let's jump forward to 12. Oh, excuse me, same chapter, it looks like. 12 through 24. Is that right? Or maybe, I'm sorry, maybe it's chapter 12, verse 24. My handwriting's sloppy. Chapter 12, verse 24. Where is it? And to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. We're actually going to talk about the blood in our next session, so I don't want to go too far into that part of it, but I want to just mention that both of these passages are very clearly stating that Jesus is the mediator. And one of the things that's very, very clear within the Christian Orthodox position is that there is only one mediator to God, and that is Jesus Christ. Not these other entities, not these Orishas, not these Wa, not anything else, okay? All of that is deception. That is also something to keep in mind. I want to read one last passage from the Bible before we close out this video. And this is in 1 John, so the letter 1 John. And it is chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. So 1 John, chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. It says this: Behold, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God, this is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you have heard was coming and now is in the world already. The divinity of Christ is a central component of discerning fake spirits from the real spirits. What is the pattern here? I started this video talking about discernment. I believe that part of the goal of this age of disclosure is going to be to generate and create confusion. They're going to overwhelm us with information, and it's going to be disorienting to the point where we don't really know what to think. And then they're going to come in with it. Here's what it is. And they're going to kind of give it to us. And most people are just going to take it. Be like, okay, that makes sense. It all lines up, fits all these different things, right? And they'll believe it. And God's going to allow that according to the passage. But what is the pattern here? How do we discern the true message from the false message? Well, I think that we're given a couple things here. Is it promoting secret knowledge? Some type of new age of enlightenment, a knowledge that was not available to all. That's Gnosticism, okay? And that becomes the foundation of all these esoteric traditions, Freemasons down the line. Is it suggesting there's some other thing as a mediator? In the folk religions, again, we talked about the Loa and the Orishas. In these other traditions, you learn about a pantheon of gods and goddesses, demigods, demons, who are the mediating bodies to humans, okay? In the Christian tradition, there's only one. It's Jesus, right? He's the only mediator. Is Jesus the Son of God? That's going to be another big one. They're going to argue, no, he was just another great prophet that every tradition has their version of him. Like Pythagoras, like Siddhartha Gautama. He came, he was sent by them, he may have even been created by them to help advance humanity. And that actually it wasn't Christ who was the problem. It was the way in which his followers, people like Paul and others, took his teachings and contorted them to a different way. That's also not scriptural. Jesus is the Son of God. He's not a sage, right? He's not simply a prophet or thinker. Jesus is the only mediator. He doesn't need other beings, saints or otherwise, to interact or intercede for him. And there was another one that I totally forgot. Oh, secret knowledge. Unlike Pythagoras, Jesus didn't promote secret knowledge, okay? They're going to try to argue that he did. They're going to say, well, he spoke in parables. And these parables were secret knowledge because only the apostles really understood them. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says he gives them the parables. He tells them what it is, but some people just refuse to hear it. They don't want to listen. They don't want to understand, or they don't care. But he makes his message available to all. And it's not about an select few. It's available to all. Okay, so these are the differences, okay, when it comes to the information that you're going to be receiving, okay? Listen to what they're saying, okay? Are they talking about the dawning of a new enlightenment, a new age, okay? Are they talking about other esoteric traditions like other gods and goddesses in the past and how these pantheon of beings have always been there? Are they looking to old ancient civilizations like Egypt and Mesopotamia? Are they talking about this sort of psionic experience with interdimensional beings? It's all tied together, in my opinion. That may explain some of the information that we may receive. But what about when we're seeing into the spirit realm? In my last video, I tried to talk about, I think it was my first video, I don't remember, seeing into the spirit, okay? A lot of these stories that people are reporting about alien encounters, alien abductions, interactions with these higher order beings are very similar to what we find with demonic possession, or at least demonization in the form of demonic oppression. In one of my later videos, I'm going to actually talk about the term demonic possession and why this is problematic, but that's for a different day. But the idea is the interaction or communion with demons. And particularly in the UFO space, which is where a lot of this is centered on with this age of disclosure, I personally have noticed there are there's similar patterns, but there's a few key things that sometimes get overlooked. Okay, so I've read them all. So whether it's like Whitney Schreiber or whether it's what's her name, Turner, Carla Turner, I think is her name, Travis Walton. He may not be exactly the same on this, but certainly more recently, Chris Bledsoe. Okay, all of these people in their autobiographical accounts of their experiences have somewhat cloudy memories of these events. When they come to the point of actually articulating these experiences, these psionic alien encounters, they all go through hypnotic regression. Now, the thing that's interesting about hypnotic regression is it's about recovering lost memories. And one thing we know is that the mind is very unpredictable, and that actually it's very easy to implant false memories, okay, when a person is in a hypnotic state. Because essentially what the hypnosis is doing is it's suppressing their normal defense mechanisms, okay, and making them essentially adopt a passive cognitive space. And the reason to do that is so that they can retrieve things that may have been repressed. But what they're also doing is opening themselves up to other things. Now, in the scientific space of scientific reductionism, they view this to be safe as long as it's a reputable psychologist or hypnotist, doing the hypnosis. Because the idea is they have to be trained on how not to implant ideas. And I believe that probably most of these people are well-meaning people who are trying to do the right thing and help these people with this repressed trauma. But if you factor in the spiritual reality and you're talking about opening a door to a person's mind where their natural defense mechanisms are gone, and we know from the stories that the demonic has the ability to tempt and put thoughts in people's heads, it is possible that these people are opening themselves up to demonic uh, possession in some form, or at least some type of demonic oppression, and that some of these repressed memories could be fed to them through some type of demonic spiritual involvement. Obviously, I can't prove any of that, but it certainly makes sense. There's also, of course, this sort of disagreement on crafts and beings and all this kind of stuff, and it gets very, very strange. I would defer to someone like Michael Heiser in this case. He writes a lot about this. There's others out there writing about it, but it's something that I noted as I was reading all these people. They give these stories, and they kind of like, well, we didn't really know what it was until we went into hypnotic regression. I'm like, there you go. So what really was it? Okay, I don't know myself, but whether this stuff is true, which I think some of it will be proven to be true, whether it's complete conjecture or made up, which probably a lot of it is, it doesn't matter. What's going to matter is that it's going to be sold as the truth, and a lot of people are going to believe it. Okay, that's my theory. Whether my theory is correct or not, time will tell. But if nothing else, all of this and all the forms of examples I provided should hopefully help you to understand how to discern right from wrong, how to discern the teachings of the gospel versus those that aren't. And I gave you a very simple template, right? Secret knowledge, okay, mediators, Jesus is not the Son of God. Okay, those are like the three big ones. And you look for those little clues, okay? But lastly, getting back to these visions and these encounters and these experiences that I was talking about, this is where I wanted to go. So how do you discern the spirit realm? A lot of times these experiences are very disorienting. Okay, these people talk about it, and yet they become obsessed with it. It becomes this compulsive drive to know more. Who is it? What is it? Okay, There's a sense of feeling unique or special, as though you were selected or chosen specially. The problem that people make when it comes to demonic is they think that demons act the way they are, and they don't. They're liars. So they appear and act in the ways that you would never guess. A great example of this can be found in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia series with the White Witch, right? The White Witch wins over, I think it's Edmund. I don't know, it's been a long time since I read that, but the young boy by playing to his ego, by giving him attention, by feeding him Turkish delight, right? A lot of these people who have these psionic experiences with these higher level beings, so whether it's a spirit guide or an orisha that they serve or worship, or whether they believe it's a dead ancestor, they report this sort of euphoria that can happen, this sort of peacefulness that they feel, okay? And they think that as a result of that, that means it's of God. But if you read the Bible carefully, you'll find something that's very, very important. And this is what I want to end on when it comes to discerning in the Spirit. When people, whoever it is, Paul, Peter, John, encounter the living God or his holy messengers, their reaction is a reaction of repentance. It's transformative, but it's transformative in a way where it reveals their fallen nature. It reveals their sin. It doesn't celebrate them. It doesn't build them up and make them feel awesome. It doesn't make them think that they have some higher order or superpower. Paul literally had a vision of Christ on the road to Damascus, right? John literally received the revelations of God while on the island of Patmos. But at no point in time did he believe that that meant he was unique or special in any other way. He recognized that he still was a sinner and that the only way that they could be redeemed was through Christ. So, if you're seeing in the spirit realm, ask yourself, what is the Spirit bringing? First of all, does it declare Jesus as the Son of God? But also, is it there to build your ego, to guide you? Does it lead you on these rabbit trails down alternative paths? But does it give you feelings of joy or peace? Or does it say, you need to change your life? You need to get back on track because you're sinning. And the only way that you're going to make it through this is through repentance. That's the message of the gospel. And that's what the apostles and the disciples of Christ did when they had any type of vision in the spirit realm. So hopefully that's another little tool you can use for discerning in the spirit and discerning the demonic. Will all the things I say come true? I hope not. But I see a lot of these trends already circulating. Who knows what will happen? But again, this is me making some conjectures, but the end goal is, how do you discern these things from the truth? And hopefully I've given you some tools to do that. We'll be back with more videos. Still have a lot more to cover, so stay tuned.